In all stages of our history, women have been struggling through a second-class life. It wasn't just that women didn't have the right to vote or that they didn't get equal pay. Women's lives were like a horror story. Here are 12 horrible realities of being a woman throughout history. Women's menstruation. A prominent Roman philosopher, Liny the Elder, wrote this about women's menstruation. On the approach of a woman in this state, milk will become sour. He then went on to say, a swarm of bees, if looked upon by her, will die immediately. In both Egypt and Israel, women spent their menstrual cycles in separate buildings where men were not allowed. Israelis were convinced that by touching a woman on her menstrual cycle, or even anything she touched while she was on her menstrual cycle, would render them all unclean. In Hawaii, the penalty of death could be leveled against a man who entered the hut of a menstruating woman. Women were expected to die when their husbands did. Women may have a longer life expectancy than their husbands do now, but in East Asia, up until the 1800s, when a woman lost her husband, she was required to die as well. This was known as the practice of sati. So, if the wife didn't kill herself before the funeral, she would have to brave the funeral pyre while still alive. But brides weren't just burned for regular funerals. They would also burn themselves and their children ahead of military attacks if the war effort was going poorly for their husband. Women were forced to kill their own children. Women were forced to become the villain themselves when it came to unwanted births. In ancient Rome, the mother of a baby with a disability was expected to abandon it somewhere or suffocate it themselves. Even in Israel, the bones of at least 100 disabled babies have been found by archaeologists in the city's sewer system by the shore. A bell fastened to her head. If you were a woman in ancient Greece or Rome, there was no complaining either. Women were not allowed to speak when company came, let alone sit down to dinner. It was early bedtime and dinner in their room for the women of the house, so as not to disturb the men. And the only time women were allowed to leave the house was in the company of men, a practice that many women put up with to this day. At least it's not as bad as medieval Denmark, where women who argued or vented their grievances were restrained in something called a shrew's fiddle. While this device would bind a woman's hands and face, the real insult was making her walk around town with a bell fastened to her head to complete the humiliation. Slave girls were one thing, but wives were another. Sleeping with someone's slave girl may have been a misdemeanor in Rome, but wives were a different story. A male who was a Roman citizen could kill his wife without repercussion, as long as he killed her male lover as well. Baby girls. Although women have been historically discriminated against during their time of the month, this is still much better than the baby girls in ancient Greece and Rome ever got. While favoring the birth of baby boys, baby girls were commonly the victim of something called exposing, where they were left in the wilderness by their parents to die. Even Egyptian girls, who were more socially equal, didn't fare much better when they came from poor families. Property damage. In ancient Rome, a priestess who served the goddess Vesta could be buried alive if she was sexually active before the age of 30. On the other hand, sex with the master was in a Roman slave girl's job description. Friends of the master had to ask his permission to sleep with his slave girls first, or else they were charged with property damage. Owning real estate and credit cards in the United States. Women couldn't own real estate in their own name in the U.S. until 1839, and then only in the state of Mississippi. It's no wonder that even in the 1960s, an unmarried woman would find it almost impossible to get a credit card. Even into the 1970s, the card could only be issued in the husband's name. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 fixed this, but as any woman can tell you, they still have a long way to go for real equality and equal rights. The very shameful one. Women were required to be virgins until marriage, or else. Unmarried daughters who were sexually active could be sold into slavery by their fathers in ancient Athens. Meanwhile, in Samoa, part of the wedding ceremony involved manually rupturing a bride's hymen in front of the village to prove her purity. This demeaning rite was not performed by the groom, but by the chief of the tribe on his behalf. Theatrical stage. Women were not allowed to appear on the theatrical stage until 1660. Although Shakespeare wrote many of the best female roles in the history of the theater, it was illegal for women to perform them. Instead, the roles were given to prepubescent males to portray, until many years after Shakespeare's death in 1616. Kidnapping. Kidnapping brides continues as a way to get married. The capturing of women and making them into wives is even documented in the Bible. It doesn't stop there, though. In the 1800s, stealing women for wives was widespread in Ireland and existed until the 1940s in China. Shockingly enough, it went on until 1959 in Japan. Before history was recorded, the cruel treatment of women started at the dawn of civilization, even before history was recorded. In fact, it was archaeologists in Africa who found the first evidence of misogyny in the remains of prehistoric villages, which indicated that while the men remained in one place, the women were often moved around. So while the men enjoyed a long life in their own home village, the women were imported from other scattered areas. What this suggests to archaeologists is that in these involuntary marriages, women were kidnapped and then forced to start families with the men who had captured them. So that's 12 horrible realities of being a woman throughout history.